You're listening to Win-Win, an entrepreneurial community with your host, Ben Wolf.
And welcome to Win-Win, an entrepreneurial community. As always, I am your host, Ben Wolf. Very excited today to share with our guest how to find an interim executive when you need one. And remind everybody who is listening or watching this on YouTube or on your podcasts, wherever you get them, to make sure and subscribe to this wherever you're listening. Leave a review. That definitely helps more people get access to this and helps me, kind of get up in the search results and have more people have access to the value that we are sharing with business owners here. So please make sure to do that. And with that, I want to get on to introducing our guest today. He is the co-founder and CEO of Interim Execs, which matches organizations around the globe with top interim executive talent. He personally has helped transform a number of companies and get through existential crises as an interim CEO over the years. He's the author of How They Did It, $1 Billion Insights from the Heart of America, which is available on Amazon. I'm going to share a link to that in the description below or in the social media posts. He has helped launch, grow, and ultimately sell a number of fast-growing companies. You could find out more about him at interimexecs.org. That's interimexecs.org. And with that, I give you Bob Jordan. Welcome, Bob.
Hey, Ben. Thanks so much for that kind introduction, and thanks for having me on your show.
My pleasure. Very happy to have you.
One mechanical thing. Tomorrow, we're actually switching to interimexecs.com, but for now, .org is great.
Okay. Well, by the time this goes live, it will be .com.
I hope if it all goes well. Yes.
Okay. Well, we'll put it .com on there, or you'll let me know afterwards if that's not the case. But just keep me updated on that, and we'll make sure that in the social media posts and in the description, it's the correct option, whether it's interimexecs.com or .org. But I want to definitely ask you, if you don't mind sharing like a quick 2-minute background on yourself. Kind of give us a picture of how you got to be where you are now, doing the stuff with interim executives. How'd you get here? Give us a little context.
Sure. Thank you. I guess I'm your classic entrepreneur. I've been involved in all kinds of early stage businesses. I originally dropped out of business school, start my first company. It was a publishing company. We had started a magazine called Online Access. It was the first consumer magazine around the world that covered first commercial online services, then bulletin boards, and ultimately the internet. I did that a number of years, sold it to a big publishing company, was trying to figure out what to do with Act 2 of my life, and fortuitously met a guy who was one of the first interim CEOs in the US, a guy named Philip Monago, and he handed me a card when he was telling me what an interim CEO was, and his new card said CEO of Yahoo. And in the industry, we knew Yahoo was going to go public within a short time of its founding on zero revenue. And so what Philip described to me of the career was so fascinating. I came home, I bought 2 domains, interimceo.com and interimcfo.com, and I started doing gigs. Mm-hmm. I was doing that for a number of years. Social networks came around. I started wondering how many other people in the world were like me. We formed Interim Execs 12 years ago and started becoming a matchmaker, deploying executives around the world. And I stopped doing gigs, and we developed a concept called Red Team, Rapid Executive Deployment, Red Team.
Mm-hmm. And when was that? When did you develop
6 years ago. That was 6 years ago, and so that's what we've been doing ever since.
Very cool. So I want to dive into that a little bit more, but if you could first define for us, and for those people who are not familiar with the concept, people who listen to or watch this show are, we've been talking a lot, especially in the last few months, about fractional leadership. So this interim executive is a somewhat different concept. So I call it cousins, so define for us, what is an interim executive? What does that mean?
You can use interchangeably the words interim, contract, project-based. We also use the word fractional. Fractional tends to be longer term part-time. But in all cases, they
Mhm.
refer to executives taking on project-based roles as opposed to permanent full-time employment.
Right. Okay. And what I'm curious, what percentage of the time are people like what percentage of the time is this full time? Interim, but full time versus fractional or part time, whatever you want to call it.
That's a great question. That is so situational for both the needs of the organization, the client that shows up, and the makeup of the executive. So, for example, executives who tend to specialize in turnaround,
Uh-huh.
fixing broken companies, usually you will hear those executives describe their careers that it is very linear. They do only one gig at a time.
Mm-hmm.
When they're engaged in fixing something, it's a 24/7 round the clock effort to save. They're not going into trivial situations. They're going into really messed up things that need help right now. So those situations you will hear, it's going to be linear. For a lot of executives, though, they can pursue multiple clients in parallel,
Mm-hmm.
especially when they're growth cases, if they're early stage, if they're just much more specialized kind of project roles.
Mm-hmm. Right. And would you say in your experience what the breakdown is like of those scenarios? Either the turnarounds or the full times versus the
Well, I can tell
others.
you in our particular world, based on our stats, about 1/3 of all inquiries are distressed based, and
Right.
2/3 we would say are not truly distressed based.
Okay.
Now, as opposed to the 100% measure, I can tell you we just did a survey end of last year, beginning of this year. We surveyed 600 interims around the world, and the average engagement was about 8.5 months.
Uh-huh.
So, you know,
That's between that's both full time and fractional.
yeah, and in our world, we generally say full on as opposed to full time,
Okay.
because full time, a lot of
Right.
people in the world assume means you're getting a paycheck
Implies right of
and a
employment. Yeah.
salary and
Yeah.
all of that. And so we try to be specific, saying, "Are you full on?"
Right.
Um, uh,
Yeah.
little
You don't want to
distinction.
use right. No, it makes sense. You don't want to use confusing terminology. So let's describe, and there may be two general scenarios here, but you say a little bit more about like what are the kind of situations that people are finding themselves in before they're calling you? What are the situations? What are the problems that they're facing?
That's a great question. When we do case studies afterwards, what you're describing, we call the blood in the streets. What's the what's the
Yeah.
situation? Um, there are the obvious use cases, which is to say someone's just gone. There's a gap
Right.
in a
The
leadership
CEO
role.
quits or somebody gets sick all of a sudden.
Exactly. Yeah, someone gets sick, dies, fired, whatever.
Right.
That is a common use case. Sometimes that's substantive, and sometimes it's a check the box kind of function that we don't really want to be
Right.
involved in. So, for example, you see a lot of press
Right.
releases.
Not just a play. You don't want to be a placeholder.
No,
That's not what
exactly.
your people are there for.
Yeah, and so you'll see a lot of press releases, public companies, they'll say, huge companies, and they'll say somebody was appointed the interim CEO. Invariably, they've chosen someone from the board who literally is a placeholder, is not going to be making any decisions at all other than to
Mm,
sign off on the financials.
right.
That's not what we mean, and that is not this industry as its own category.
Right.
It's much more described as operating executives, at least in our definition, operating executives who are over time taking on responsibility and authority to hire and fire and make decisions.
Right. Actual decision making authority.
Absolutely. As distinguished from the world of consulting.
So what else? Right. So you have these like blood in the street situations, or somebody leaves in a crazy situation, and you need an operating executive. What else?
So other kinds of use cases, that's the obvious one.
Right.
The good kinds of use cases are, for example, a new product launch, and the management team has never faced it before and doesn't have the right caliber of talent. The
Mm-hmm.
need for fundraising to launch, the need to go into new markets, to go into international markets. There are all kinds of good things companies go through that just aren't part of the normal operation day-to-day of the business. Now, for companies that have an owner or a family in ownership, you've got other things going on. You could have generational change in control, and if the next generation isn't ready, that company may go through a sale. You have businesses rapidly growing, they may need to go through an IPO.
Right. You need
So those
someone who's done that before. They need.
exactly.
Now, I think one thing that I think would help give people who are listening like a better picture of when this is a good solution for them, or for their friends, is like, what are some situations where people are calling you or inquiring with you guys, and you're telling them, this is not right. This is not right for you. This is not a good fit. What are some of those situations?
Well, sometimes it's downright evil. I mean,
What do you mean evil?
you have con artists, you have people who have control of businesses, and they're looking for a highly qualified, experienced executive with a great reputation to kind of get in front of them. And this is the beauty of the internet, being able to do research and background on people.
What?
But at the extreme end, we've absolutely had calls from people who you would want to cross to the other side of the street if you knew who they were.
So do you
Now,
have, as part of your process, a background check on any clients who reach out to you?
I wouldn't say literally background check, but you absolutely, we have very smart people in our organization, and by definition, working with executives who are very smart and experienced and can kind of see around corners. And
Right.
so,
See what's really happening, and there's some red flags that are going off.
oh, absolutely. And usually we want that up front so we can make our own
Yeah.
good diligence decisions to reject them. There is
Right.
that percentage. It's not large. There's a larger percentage also on the negative side that they're just plain flaky. They're people trying to be opportunistic, whose businesses are not of size, not sufficiently funded, but they're taking a flyer. They're just hoping someone will buy into their vision. I don't even mean legitimate startups. I just mean people who are whatever. So you have that. Then you start getting into the legitimate side of things, which is companies that have significant sales, earnings, or lack of earnings, but they have a market, they have viable products and services. And I would describe it generally as the lower middle market on up to the middle market. So however you want to define that, is that 25 million revenue, 50 million? Is it going up to 500 million to $1 billion? You're in a good, healthy range for these executives. It just doesn't play too small. And frankly, it doesn't play too large. You get into the Fortune 100 and you're looking at succession plans so deep that in most cases, they're not. We don't consider that to be a big
Right.
market.
And
Private equity is a big market. Family owned is good.
And what's too small typically?
Most startups would never be able to swing this. Even to convince an executive to, a veteran executive to forego most of the cash-based fee, the background of most of these executives is not startups. And so they tend to come from the exact same background as you probably always heard about private equity. Private equity tends to break into these four major buckets: manufacturing, business services, healthcare, technology. And if you look at the background of a lot of successful interims, they tend to come from one of those four backgrounds, either manufacturing, business services, healthcare, or tech.
And then if people are, when people are bringing on an interim, what are they like? What are the results look like? And again, whenever you could bring in examples, I think that would help make it more concrete. But what does it look like? What are they accomplishing when they get there? What do people expect when they bring on an interim executive?
Well, not too much of an ad, but we have testimonials on the website, including video. And I mean, this is where, I feel like I'm doing God's work, because you'll hear companies sometimes turn around, sometimes not. But for example, we were approached by a family owns a lot of farmland in California, and grapes, and they started a packaging company for the grapes, and called up because the packaging business had completely broken down. The equipment was broken down. They'd laid off all 150 workers. Mysteriously, the former executive had decided to retire, and they were showing a lot of losses they could not explain. We put in one of our red team executives, and within 8 weeks, equipment was back up and running. 150 people rehired, top 2 outside customers came back in. It swung completely over back into healthy profits within 3 months. And so we're doing good work there. We have other organizations that would say thanks to an executive we brought in, one organization said we had caused $1 billion plus increase in their fortunes over time from one CEO decision.
Wow.
So that's what we're trying to do.
Right. And you're bringing people in who've, they've been in this situation before. You talk about these family businesses or situations where people want to scale, or obviously, certainly these situations we have a complete vacuum of, of authority for some reason.
Yeah. I'll tell you, Ben, one thing that came out of the blue, because my whole background had been technology and, thinking about IPOs and M&A. And when we flipped the switch on, we got calls from nonprofits as well as private and public companies. And it never occurred to me that any nonprofit would call us. And then it was like, oh yeah, they need good leadership too.
Right.
And so we started developing and cultivating a set of executives who were completely dedicated to nonprofit improvement.
Interesting.
There are some executives who cross over who can still be good in those roles. We never make a lot of money at it, or we haven't yet, but great karma points. And you really are helping organizations, when the match is good. And again, there are testimonials people can see on the site, but it's wonderful. You're helping good causes out. And it's invariably in those cases that an executive director or CEO is gone, and the organization they probably need something transformational, but they have to get to the next permanent person. And in nonprofit, I now know from a lot of friends who do permanent headhunting, you're looking at a 9-month process. So what's going to happen in that organization in 9 months? And so we've seen some wonderful transformational things by bringing in execs who not only help the organization, but they're then helping recruit and onboard the next permanent leader.
Right. And they know what to look for in that person, and they could set them up to be at a much better place than they would otherwise by the time that full-time person comes in. It's not just lost time.
Yeah. And, I'll keep tooting our horn here. I mean, there are things that executives coming in can do that are far better done by someone who is not going to be sticking around for the next 5 to 10 years. Let's just put it that way.
Do you want to say more about that?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of organizations, the boards don't want to take on things that are too painful. They may have somebody who's been there forever who shouldn't be there anymore.
Yeah.
And they just can't face decisions like that.
Right.
Private equity funds, there are organizations that are PE funds and look like that. And they may have portfolio companies that are in painful shape, and they don't want to do the necessary painful thing, which is sometimes you have to sell it, or you have to shut it down, or you have to let somebody go if it's going to grow. And that could be really hard to put as a burden on the next permanent person in the role. And frankly, a lot of those permanent people don't want to walk into a storm.
Right. And being the bad guy or
being the bad guy. And most organizations, they don't want to present to the new executive like things are terribly wrong. Challenging, sure, but not out and out wrong.
Right.
So.
Right. They don't have to be the one that did that.
Yeah.
That tough
thing. In Europe, Interim has been around Europe far longer than in the US. And we were
Why
talking.
Is that? Why did it evolve there earlier?
Well, it's a good question. We were talking to one of our execs in the Netherlands. This started, arguably, the Netherlands. Netherlands was the first country. And he said, there are very few major corporations here. And if an executive is being handed a new assignment and there's a significant risk it's going to go wrong, that executive doesn't want their career to be destroyed
Right.
over this one thing. And so they far rather this idea that someone comes in who wasn't going to stick around, was not vested in the organization, and could either cause a good result or not, but it wouldn't have the same taint as somebody who was
Right.
trying to advance in the organization. I thought that's interesting because that's not the American mindset.
Not the American mindset.
I don't think so.
In
I think
terms
most
of, in terms of
American,
interims, you mean? Or what do you
no,
mean?
I think in general, most American executives, because we have such a huge market and such abundance of corporations and industries and size and scale and access to capital, I think most American business people trying to rise through the ranks could have the attitude that something challenging is like, bring it on. What's
Right.
the worst that could happen? And I
Do
think
you
it's more
think
of
so? So do you think it's mainly related to that, just the size of the market, that's why it didn't evolve here as
number of
much?
opportunities. I think that in Europe, there are fewer and more concentrated major corporations. You could make the same argument now in the US around technology, but in general, you have more constrained capital and fewer bigger corporate entities in Europe. And so therefore, if you're an executive, you could view your career opportunities as being more limited.
Right.
I think the US just historically has had so much more startup activity and access to capital that a lot of executives, especially since the internet bubble, can see not only advancing in the traditional way, but can see that, there's a world if they don't stay at large corporations. And now you have this new thing, Interim, which is a completely, new career path that didn't exist in the US 20 years ago. Really, it didn't. And now it's becoming its own category.
Right. Now, what are you seeing with interim execs? Like what percentage of these interim executives are coming at kind of like an overall executive level, like COOs, CEOs type of things, versus some of the more specialized things like CFO, CIO, CTO? What are you seeing as kind of like the percentage breakdown, or like what's the breakdown there?
Well, we'd put all of what you just said across a C-suite somewhat. They're all on that level: CEO, CFO, CIO, CTO, all of those C-level.
Right.
We put into one category, and we are, what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, we're getting back a result given the fact that we only deal at that C level.
Right.
And
Well, I'm saying, but
so,
even within the C level, obviously there's things that are overall like CEO, and the things that are
yeah,
more
I mean,
specialized.
we publish so much. We tend to publish more around CEO and CFO topics. And so that for us tends to generate more search from companies saying, hey, we need a CEO or CFO. I don't know if in the market it means that. We also, of course, work with CIOs, CTOs, CMOs, and all of that. But our experience is that the two biggest requests are CEO or CFO.
Okay. And I guess the last thing I want to ask you on this topic is, I know you have, and you mentioned this earlier, the red team, which you call, developed 6 or 7 years ago, the Rapid Executive Deployment Team. I know you've also created this Association of Interim Executives, a few years before that. What's the difference between them? What are they?
So here's our evolution. 12 years ago, we created a free search site, and it failed utterly. And when you put years and over $1 million into something, I'm not saying that with glee. I can smile now, but
Right.
it was painful. I mean, our whole premise was we live in a Google-driven world, so everyone wants their information for free. Fine, we'll put up thousands of executives around the world, and you can, in a second, you need a CFO in New York, type it in. Okay, we did that. And the breaking point was one day we got a call from a private equity fund and they said, we need a CFO. And my head explodes because they saw the phone number on the site. And I said, you just needed to type in CFO and you would have had, I don't know, 1,000 results.
Right.
And the PE guy said, no, we want you to tell us who to hire.
Right.
And I thought, we got it 100% wrong. 100% wrong. And so we then spent the next 3 years creating the opposite, highly vetted, curated, and maybe first concept in the world. There are associations in European countries individually. We created something called Association of Interim Executives and did that for a couple of years and realized that was also the wrong model for a lot of reasons.
So that's not a thing anymore. Is that what you're saying?
No, that's
Okay.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was also the wrong model because there are many associations where the presumption is that if you get in, you've been given this status.
Right.
And what we realized was
right, but only the red team are the ones for you guys that have that status.
Right. We realized that just because you could pay us, and it doesn't even matter how much you pay us, that doesn't mean you're good.
Right. If you're not doing some sort of vetting.
Yeah, it was and good is a really long explanation of what it takes to be great doing this work. It is not simply that you had a great corporate career. That is not enough by far. That is not enough to have success as an interim doing this work.
Well, what demonstrates that an interim? I know there was one other question I want to ask you before we end, and we're running out of time a little bit. But what would you say is the main headline for what differentiates what's going to make someone a great interim versus what made them a great executive full time?
Well, a lot of execs, they're disappointed to hear this when they're at the beginning of their new career doing this, but bit of a catch-22, which is you had to have had success either in a corporate career or an entrepreneurial career. You rose high and did great things, measurable things, accountable things, not just rising in the ranks, but things where you could say, I took this business from 10 to 100. I took it from $1 billion to $5 billion, whatever it is. Then you had to go out on your own and take on projects and win in those projects in a measurable way. I went to this portfolio company from this fund. I took it from 30 to 90. I helped them sell it for 12 times earning. Okay. And this is where I say, sorry, but it's not fair. And we're not really an employment agency, because a lot of executives show up and they think, I'm great. And even though I've never done this, I'm sure I could do it. Well, you may be sure, but I don't know that means we're going to test you out on a client.
Right.
And this is where it's a very difficult decision for a lot of executives, which is, are you committed to it? Because if you're committed to it, then come hell or high water, you're going to do these projects and you're going to succeed. And then someone like us will decide to work with you for years and years to come.
But not beforehand. Before that,
usually not.
Before that demonstrated success.
There are those rare cases where somebody shows up and they haven't done it before and it still works, but it is much more common that the executive already was doing it when they applied us.
Right. Understood. And there's one other thing I wanted to cover, which is I know you have a big, some big news in something that you're involved in as a passion project. That there was a book you just came out with on Audible of where you recorded the audio, and tell us about that project. I think people are going to find this very cool.
You're a kind man, Ben. I had a partner for 20 years. Name is Jim Camp. He was a negotiations coach. He helped me earlier in my career when I was getting hammered by venture capital investors, and just wonderful mentor. And he had a workbook, and I convinced him to give me the workbook, see if I could get it published. Penguin Random House published it years ago. It's called Start With No.
Oh.
And, as we all know, audio trends, here we are, Ben, on your podcast.
Yeah.
Audio trends over the text version of books at least 10 times. And so with Penguin Random House, we just came out with the unabridged audio version that's on Audible of Start With No, and I got to narrate it. And
Wow.
Jim passed away a couple of years ago, and so this was it was great. Just a
Great tribute.
great tribute to a wonderful person. And the advice was timeless. His advice on negotiating is something I think is so vital for all of us, and especially people who are young in their careers, that it's just painful. They just, people young in their careers just tend to get hammered by people
Right.
or taken advantage of. And so thank you for letting me mention that. I'm just thrilled that it came out.
Yeah. Oh, well, congratulations on that. And yeah, definitely keep us posted on whether it's interimexecs.com or .org. And I think that it's great work that you're doing. I'm very happy that we're able to have you on, and I think it's a great tool that more people should be aware of and more people should know about. And so I appreciate you coming on the Win-Win Show and talking about it.
Thank you, Ben. God bless. I really appreciate it.
You too. Thank you so much. And I appreciate what you were able to share today. And we will see everybody else on the other side. Thank you very much.
You're listening to Win-Win, an entrepreneurial community with your host, Ben Wolf.